What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the PFF podcast. It is Tuesday, March 28th, and the Oakland Raiders are officially the Los Angeles Raiders. Well, not for two more years, but they're going to be the Las Vegas Raiders. And, well, as an observer, Sam, I have to say I'm pretty jacked up about it. I'm excited that there's going to be a team in Las Vegas purely as an outside, someone who gambles regularly on the NFL. I think that's a good step in the right direction for the league, being more responsive and accepting towards gambling. But you got to feel for Raiders, Oakland fans. It's just another team. It's probably the one I feel the most sad for the fan base, because this team's actually doing well. Of all the teams that have moved in recent years, San Diego Chargers, the St. Louis Rams, Raiders are actually on the cusp of being something good with the roster they have, and to just have it ripped away, it's awful.
Yeah, as an observer, a gambler, and a man that frequents Vegas, this is pretty much the perfect move in terms of franchises for you. It's also...
Yeah, I just was in Vegas when it happened. It was pretty exciting.
You've also got to feel for the Raiders fans, because this is the second time that Oakland have lost their team. You know, the Raiders moved before. They bolted from Oakland, they went to Los Angeles, they came back, now they're leaving again. And it's just because, public funding for stadiums is what it comes down to, which is, it's kind of crazy. That's the driving force behind any of these NFL moves. It's which city is willing to bend over backwards the most to accommodate billion-dollar franchises.
Yeah, and the thing is, the NFL has all the leverage because there are 32 teams. It's a limited, it's a scarce resource. If you want a team as a city, you're going to have to pay for the team, because if not, someone else will. It's basically what it's coming down to. And teams don't have, we've seen again and again, there's no loyalty in ownership. The loyalty is to the dollar. So whoever's going to make them the most money, whoever's going to get them the most fans in the seats, the most merchandise moving, that's where they're going to go. So it's really a terrible situation all around. But yeah, I have to say, I'm going to be going to some games in Las Vegas for the Raiders.
It does definitely. It jumps to the top of the kind of road trip venue that anyone should be taking in. That new stadium that they're looking at building in Vegas looks phenomenal. The idea that the Raiders of all teams is rocked up in Sin City. It looks like a spectacular place to go, but I inherently hate any team that leaves its city, or I hate the situation. Any team that has their team, or any city that has their team abandon them, that fan base I just feel sorry for every single time. And especially for a city like Oakland, who's already had it happen once.
Yeah, this now, though, the Raiders in Las Vegas, this has to be the worst home field advantage in the NFL, right? Every single game is going to be filled with opposing teams' fans going there for, like you said, a road trip. It is basically the single best destination for any away fans in the NFL right now.
Yeah, they'll basically just have to hope that they can create enough of a chaotic, raucous home atmosphere from just like psychotic partying, drunk gambling fans that just happen to be there every single week. It's just claim them as the home support, and hope that they'll make noise at the right time. Yeah,
although I guess it could be worse than Los Angeles, the Chargers having only 27,000 people in their stadium. I'm not sure which is worse at this point, but yeah, I have to think, even for basically every divisional game, just how close, Denver's going to be, how close Kansas City's going to be, how far away, how that's not too far for the opposing fan bases to go and just basically pack the stadium every time.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see. I mean, that stadium looks phenomenal, and that is one of the most unusual cities in the entire country. Las Vegas is a unique place that is populated massively by just visitors. There's not that big a kind of permanent residence. It's going to be really interesting to see what kind of crowd that creates.
I want to know, though, what the atmosphere is going to be like in Oakland these next 2 years. Is it going to be kind of a rally around this team that we have that could win it all in one of the next 2 years? They have that kind of roster at the moment, with Derek Carr, Amari Cooper. this just stacked roster that should be good and competing for the next, handful of years? Are they going to rally around that? Or is it going to be screw Mark Davis? No one show up and boycott the Raiders. No one show up at the field. Which one is it? Which one do you think it goes towards?
I think you're going to get some protests and some negativity, but I think people are going to want to see them before they leave, especially if they're winning. That's going to draw people there, whatever happens. So I think, you're going to get some negativity and some protests and that kind of thing. But I don't think you'll see a drop off in attendance. I think the people are still going to turn up and see.
Yeah, I know if this was like my favorite team and it was where I lived, I'd probably, try to relish that last 2 years because there's nothing you can do. The protests are going to fall on deaf ears. There's not going to change. Mark Davis isn't going to see how upset they are and, all of a sudden rethink his decision. You have to make the best of a bad situation at this point, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, that's the biggest news in the NFL this week. Really not much else going on. Probably the second biggest headline is that Tom Brady says he wants to play for 5 to 6 more years, which that takes him into his mid-40s. Certainly older than any other quarterbacks made it up until this point. But I'm going to say it. I don't think it's crazy to think that he could play 5 to 6 more years at this point. Am I wrong in saying that?
I mean, right now, the evidence says he could do that. But the problem is that's happened before where the evidence at this kind of age has said this guy could go on 3, 4, 5 more years and eventually that guy hits a wall. How long did George Blanda last? He went into his 40s. But I think I
know Vinny Testaverde made it to 44 before he retired. I don't know.
I think the last couple of years of George Blanda's career were not exactly pretty. Like I say, I think Brady right now is playing as well as he has ever played in his entire career. So if you looked at him just in 2016 and said, how long has this guy got left? You wouldn't be writing him off anytime soon. But the problem is you could say the same thing with Brett Favre in 2009 and with Peyton Manning in 2013, 14. And eventually those guys just hit the cliff. With Favre, it was he hit a point where his Iron Man durable body just decided to break. That had been the thing that kept him going for so many years. He got injured plenty, but he was durable enough to go through it. And eventually he just hit a point where it couldn't happen anymore. Like there was a video posted by, was it Robert Alford of the Atlanta Falcons the other day? Favre was in town just throwing some balls to these guys. He's still got a cannon. Like that guy could step out in the field now, and if nobody was allowed to touch him, he could deliver any NFL pass you wanted him to. And then Peyton Manning, you had the same kind of thing. He just physically hit a wall, and what was already a marginal arm since the neck surgery at his time in Indianapolis just became completely untenable, and he couldn't get it done anymore. Now, Brady is an interesting guy because he doesn't get hit much. So in that regard, he's a lot like Peyton Manning, who was very good at avoiding getting hit by getting rid of the ball. So he's not going to break like Favre broke, which is you reach a point where you're just getting physically battered. I don't think that's going to happen to him. And he hasn't had the big surgery that kind of diminished his physical abilities the way Manning did back in 2011.
See, I think that's the biggest thing is once you get hurt at the age of 40, you have so Favre had the biceps tear, obviously Manning had the neck and then the quad.
Yeah, so
you get hurt like there, you don't have the recovery time. You're just not recovering back to full strength at that point, just because at that age the muscles don't regenerate that. So you get hurt, he gets a major injury, all of a sudden that's it for him because the muscles it's not coming back at that age. So I think that's obviously the biggest thing. But if he doesn't, I don't think there's anything to say in my mind that he won't be able to make it that far.
And that's the key to him at the moment, is he hasn't had one of those yet. So he's kind of working from 100% right now, and the only question is how far can he stay at 100%? And it's going to come down. But the thing is, once you get into your 40s, it doesn't even necessarily need to be many hits. It can just be one shot that finishes you off because you're now old and brittle. So, Brady doesn't necessarily need to suddenly get under an overwhelming amount of pressure and just collapse under the hits. It could be one shot that just breaks something, snaps a tendon, tears a muscle, that kind of thing. I just think it's really unlikely a guy makes it through another 5, 6 years of NFL play without something relatively significant happening, or without him hitting that wall that every other guy has hit. I think we're going to see him basically play well until something happens to knock that back, and I think that's probably going to be the beginning of the end of his career.
I agree. I do think it's ridiculous to think he can go 5 to 6 more years without some sort of, not catastrophic injury, but without some sort of injury that's, actually limits him and actually holds him back. But then at that point, you're going from, top 5 quarterback of all time to he could still be middle of the pack at this point, just with his decision making, with that sort of thing, even if the arm isn't, nearly as accurate as it was, as it is now. And we've seen guys like Jamie Moyer in the MLB pitch till they're 45. And I think he had 16 wins when he was 45 at a sub-4 ERA. It's not, the arm doesn't necessarily diminish so much to where your accuracy is going to be all over the place. You don't just lose it that way. So I think, I do think he plays 3 to 4 more years at least.
Yeah, the problem with that is that's kind of what we thought with Peyton Manning, is that even when his arm becomes a total noodle, he's still got the smarts. He's one of the smartest quarterbacks to ever play the game. He'll just be able to carve.
He kind of did. He kind of did, though.
Not that last year, though. I mean, he was
2 years.
Some horrendous.
I'm saying he kind of. I mean, it went full noodle though. It was pretty atrocious.
But even when it did go full noodle, he wasn't able to overcome that with, the smarts.
I think it was his legs though was the bigger thing. He just couldn't plant and throw on it. He just wasn't the same in that regard. When his arm was nothing, he could still, flip his hips and clear and, make somewhat accurate throws. But when his legs when he couldn't plant and stuff, when he was, worried about himself in the pocket, I think that's when it just everything built up to what we saw that last year, even though they won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, that wasn't pretty. I mean, he was making some horrific plays, just some dumb decisions.
So say Brady wants to go 5 or 6 more years. Say realistically 3 more years. Say realistically he has 3 more years. That brings him into 2 years of Jimmy Garoppolo sitting the bench still behind them after they would have to sign him to a second contract. So that brings up the question, would you trade Jimmy Garoppolo right now if you are Bill Belichick and you are running the New England Patriots? Would you be realistically looking to trade him?
I don't think I would, because, well, it depends. I mean, it's going to depend on your evaluation of him. If you think he can be the guy to replace Tom Brady, I don't let him go almost regardless of what's being offered, because you're going to need that sooner or later. And I don't think at this point in his career, even if Brady says he wants to play 5 or 6 more years, that you can trust that's going to happen. You have to assume that any one of these years from now on can be his last if what we just talked about happens. If he gets an injury that sets him back, if he suddenly just hits that wall and is not the same guy again, you have to work on the basis that you're going to need to replace this guy pretty soon. And it is really, really hard to find franchise caliber quarterbacks. So if you happen to have one sitting waiting in the wings already, you have to keep that guy around. You just can't let him go and rely on being able to do it again.
I get that, but realistically, there's no chance they sign him next offseason.
They're going to have to. I mean, they would need to keep him around.
They would have to franchise. I'm saying they would have to basically franchise him to keep him around, because he hits the open market. Someone's going to throw something crazy at them.
Yeah.
I honestly we've heard teams throwing crazy trades at them already. So
you almost need to franchise him and then
back-to-back years.
Well, you franchise him 1 year and then you almost need to make the decision for Brady. I mean, that's the problem, is you get into that Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre situation where you just say, look, we have to make this decision for you, because at some point we can't wait.
Right now was the Aaron Rodgers. This was he was going into the last year of his rookie contract. So which would be basically what Garoppolo's in right now.
And it's different because Brett Favre was just dithering around every year. Will I retire? Won't I? And they went, you know what? You're retired. Decision made. It's not your call anymore. So, Brady's different.
Could you look Brady in the eye and tell him, hey, you gotta, that's this, you come back this year, you're hitting the bench, we're either forcing you to retire or you're going to be the backup next year when you come back?
I think
would they be able to do that?
I think they're going to have to at some point. I mean, you can't just keep playing until the guy is like 47 years old and waiting waiting endlessly for him to hit the
How great would
inevitable
that
wall.
be? No, Brady's like hit the wall. He's like 3 years past the wall. He's just awful, but they just don't have the sack
Yeah.
to say, "Hey Tom, hang it up," and he's just pick after pick, just
Well, either that
looking
or
for
they
that
don't have
next
the quarterback because they traded the one guy that was capable of
that.
replacing him, and they're now going through a sequence of Kevin O'Connells again. No offense.
Okay, well,
Kevin.
say I'm sure he's listening. Say Jimmy Garoppolo really is though a franchise quarterback. What would you, as a team, say he is a top 10 quarterback in the NFL right now? What would you realistically give up for that if you are a Cleveland Browns, if you are a New York Jets,
If you're
if
the
you are
Browns,
someone
almost
terribly
anything they want. Like if he
That's
is
what I'm saying. Well, put an actual number on in terms of picks in the draft. What would you give up?
if he is a top 10 quarterback, if he is a legitimate franchise quarterback, everything you think he is, there is literally no price that is too much to pay because having one of those guys fixes everything else. It at least makes you a contender every single year, even if the rest of your roster is horrendous. And the rest of that roster is not horrendous. It's getting better. So, they have like 10 picks in the draft. It's getting to the point where you would make a Herschel Walker trade for a quarterback if you know that guy is the right guy. The problem is, one, if you swing and a miss, everybody in the building is fired because you can't come back from those kind of decisions. The other thing is that even if you get the right guy and that guy gets hurt, suddenly the whole thing unravels. Like, the Redskins made a monster deal for RG3, and a year into that, it looked genius. And then RG3 gets hurt. Then there's kind of talk about he refuses to, play the game plan they created for him, and the whole thing unravels. And just because they drafted Kirk Cousins as well, they're actually still kind of okay. But had they not had Kirk Cousins, the whole thing would have been an absolute and total disaster. So look, I would give, what do they got in the moment? Number 1, number 12, a second, and like 10 more, 7 more picks.
Mm-hmm.
I would give up the first 3 picks in this draft easily for Jimmy Garoppolo if you believe he's that guy.
That's not the farm. That's not a ton. I thought you were going higher when you started.
You can add in a 1 for 2018 as well.
Okay, that's crazy. That's a lot. 3 1s and a 2. I'm not sure. I feel like especially the number 1 overall pick has more value than that with a guy like Myles Garrett, who looks, by all accounts, franchise-type pass rusher. You can win Super Bowls without a quarterback. A quarterback does fix a lot of ills, but you can win Super Bowls like we saw the Broncos do with a very talented roster.
Oh, it's so hard, though.
Top 10, and even top 10 quarterback, if you knew he was a top 5 quarterback, yeah. But the 10th best quarterback in the NFL is someone like Matthew Stafford. It's not going to get you to the playoffs year after year, even if with an average roster around you. So I don't think I would even go that much. Maybe both ones would be about all I'd give up if you knew top 10 quarterback at the moment. That's about all I'd give, which the Patriots probably wouldn't do if they thought he was a franchise guy either. So I'm just not as high on franchise quarterbacks as you, obviously.
It's so hard to win without one that I think if you have a chance to get one, you pay whatever it takes, especially when you're the Browns and you've been stockpiling picks and you have trade ammunition and you have no quarterback for the better part of like 20 years.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a fair point. Just the whole we've never had a quarterback thing, that desperation that plays into it. I think the NFL is probably more on your side, though. If they did know Jimmy was that guy, they'd probably give up a lot to go get him. So I can see that. All right, let's keep it moving. Let's go to some segments here. Talking a little, we touched on the draft there. We're going to talk about our historical power rankings for the best draft busts of all time, Sam. Let's hear yours first. I think I've been going first lately. You go ahead and do yours.
Yeah, well, I worked on the basis that being you won't have anything before like 2000. So I've gone back into time a bit.
I have 1.
You have 1.
Okay.
Well, it's going to be the same one that everyone has. So let's start with number 1, and that is the draft bust of all time, Ryan Leaf. And
such a good one.
The story is just amazing. I found ESPN's 1998 pre-draft magazine, and it's, comparing Ryan Leaf and Peyton Manning, which were the top 2 quarterbacks that season. And it was the big decision. Ryan Leaf had slightly better physical tools, slightly bigger arm, a bit more mobility, was an amazing college quarterback, and Peyton Manning was this cerebral gym rat, the quarterback's son, the perfect kind of prospect.
Mhm.
And the NFL was legitimately divided on which one of these guys was the better prospect. And when you look through the stuff that's in this magazine, it isn't just hindsight being 2020 to say that this is the most idiotic decision ever. It was clear that Ryan Leaf was a head case from reading this stuff. The interview in this magazine takes place from a hot tub in which the interviewer describes Ryan Leaf easing his giant bloated girth that he's inflated from a postseason on the dinner circuit, as opposed to being in the the gym or the film room breaking down stuff. Like, I think there's gold chains hanging from him involved as well. It's ridiculous. Like, it's the most cliched, ludicrous story, and you're like, how could you possibly not see that there were red flags involved in this guy? And then, of course, Ryan Leaf turns out he's a bit of a lunatic, gets him, doesn't get on well with teammates, gets involved in drugs, and craps out of the league pretty quickly. Whereas Peyton Manning becomes one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game.
I love Ryan Leaf's rookie year stat line. That was 2 touchdowns to 15 interceptions.
That is impressive.
Which is unbelievable. It's just even in an era where passing offenses were not nearly as sophisticated. Those numbers, I would love to go back and grade that season just to see how, because it had to be even worse than those numbers suggest. I mean, it just had to be 45.3 completion percentage. It was not even trying. That's unbelievably bad. Yeah.
So number 2, I've actually kept relatively modern. And I think it's just because of the potential was just insane. Jamarcus Russell, number 1 overall pick, Oakland Raiders.
No, I had the same. That's
just his numbers. 6'6", 260 pounds, had a huge arm, was just this physical freak. And this was in an era where Michael Vick was still kind of taking the league by storm a little bit. Dante Culpepper had been really successful and was only just after tearing his knee up. So you had this kind of sequence of, Ben Roethlisberger was only a couple of years into his career, was still a pretty mobile guy there doing some crazy stuff for the Steelers. And you had this sequence of kind of physically gifted quarterbacks that were doing some amazing things. And it was like the game was developing down that route where you had these guys that were these mobile athletes. And it was almost like this perfect meld of physical dominant quarterback meets pocket passer was going to be the way that the league was going to go. And Jamarcus Russell was like the embodiment of this guy, this huge physical specimen that could stand tall in the pocket and make ridiculous throws. Had, what Mike Mayock, I think, referred to as the greatest pro day performance he'd ever seen. And then just hit the league and sucked.
That was the quintessential big arm, makes all the throws, but it's not like he made them with any sort of regularity. It was just spraying balls all over down the field. Completion percentage of 52.1 in his career, which, he was coming out. He wasn't that accurate coming out. He was the quintessential, has the big arm, but did not actually do anything else that the quarterback needs to do at the position.
Yeah. So, that didn't go well. It's a shame because Jamarcus had such potential. Here's where we go back into the time void, though, back before your time, Mike.
Oh, yeah.
Tony Mandarich.
Probably won't even recognize the name. Who's that?
Tony Mandarich was nicknamed the greatest offensive line prospect of all time by Sports Illustrated. His nickname was the Incredible Bulk. He was the first offensive lineman in NFL history to command a 7-figure salary average per year. The only downside to it was he was roided to the gills, and that's why he was such a great prospect. So when he hit the league and the old steroids became a little bit trickier to get away with, it turned out he was a really bad football player.
How are all these guys doing it now? He was too far ahead of his time. He would have had the good synthetic stuff now that they don't get caught for. As
with a lot of these guys, what makes them such great busts is the kind of surrounding story or the surrounding
the build-up.
circumstances to it. So, Mandrich being a disaster, and he actually, I think, came back and made a relatively modest second career with the Colts somewhere later in his career. But the disaster of a draft pick was made worse by the fact that the next 3 picks in the 1989 draft were as follows: Barry Sanders, Hall of Famer, arguably the greatest running back to ever play; Derek Thomas, is he a Hall of Famer? One of the greatest sack artists to ever play; and Deion Sanders, cornerback extraordinaire, arguably the greatest cover corner to ever play the game. So in that pick. Light, that doesn't look great.
Jeez.
Number 4 on my list is Lawrence Phillips, who, anytime you can basically change the way the NFL does something, it tends to make you pretty important. Lawrence Phillips essentially is the reason that teams psychologically evaluate draft prospects now, because Lawrence Phillips was a great running back at Nebraska, I think. Turned out he was an absolute psychopath and wound up in jail on various, I think, domestic abuse convictions, all that kind of thing. Whilst in jail, probably murdered his cellmate. I think he was still kind of waiting on the trial of that to work itself through before he committed suicide, hung himself with a suicide note, and now his brain has been donated to research for CTE and that kind of thing. But Lawrence Phillips was this can't-miss, slam-dunk NFL running back prospect who Dick Vermeil thought that he could mentor and keep under control and keep on the straight and narrow, and Dick Vermeil just couldn't keep the guy under wraps. He was just too far over the edge and completely flamed out in the NFL and wound up in jail and dead.
I'll say this, still not the worst pick in Rams history. I got a guy higher than it, but I'll let you go. I'll let you finish out your top 5.
That's cold. My number 5 is Rick Mirer, who was basically the Ryan Leaf to Drew Bledsoe's Peyton Manning. In 1993, I think, Rick Mirer was the number 2 overall pick when Drew Bledsoe was the number 1. Bledsoe went on to a pretty damn good career. Rick Mirer didn't. My favorite thing about Rick Meyer's draft bust status, though, is that he managed to screw over 2 different teams in his bust. Because 4 years into his career, somehow the Seahawks traded him for a first-round pick to the Chicago Bears. And at that point in his career, he had thrown 36 touchdowns and 44 interceptions. He made 3 starts for the Chicago Bears and was one of the worst ways to spend a first-round pick I can possibly imagine.
Good list. I think mine's going to be better.
Yours is going to be more recent.
Mine's going to be definitely more recent. I had Russell. I had Leaf. I'll go from number 5. Trent Richardson, another guy, bust for 2 teams. Number 3 overall pick, and they used the number 3 overall pick on a guy who legitimately was the worst running back in the NFL at the point of his career, which I think counts as a bad pick. I think that counts as a bust. He didn't have the hype aspect that your guys had, but he had the fact that when you actually use a top 5 pick, a really high pick on a guy, and he's actively hurting your team, I think that adds a whole another dimension that should be accounted for. He
looked like such a good college prospect. He's one of those ones that I mean, a lot of these guys are like that, otherwise it wouldn't be draft busts. They'd just be guys that didn't make it in the NFL. But some of these guys you watch and you think, how on earth did this guy not become a good NFL player?
That's why I'm not drafting running backs in the first round. That's just me. But Trent Richardson, number 5. Number 4, even more recent, Greg Robinson, left tackle, St. Louis Rams when he got drafted, LA Rams now, only 3 years into his career, but I'm already calling him one of the top 5 busts of all time because, again, actively hurting his franchise, one of the worst left tackles in the league every single year, has a bottom 3 grade at the position, and you took him number 2 overall in a draft that was, well, I guess they got Aaron Donald later, but there was a lot of talent there to be had. Number 2 overall, pretty ugly for him. And then the other guy had number 3, David Carr.
Oh, poor David. You can't put David Carr.
I feel bad putting him on there, but number 1 overall pick, supposed to be the face of a franchise. and just got sacked his way out of the league. Led the league in sacks 3 out of his first 4 years, just completely ruined, derailed the career. Didn't have a single winning season in 5 years as a starter, 6 years as a starter, excuse me. Just ugly.
I don't have David Carr in there for the same reason that I don't have Tim Couch on there, which is that I don't think you can blame a guy when the surrounding situation is just that bad. I mean, he was just ruined by an expansion franchise that bludgeoned him into the dirt. And exactly the same thing is true with Tim Couch. He was just destroyed by the complete lack of ability around him. So you almost don't get to know if he had the talent to be an NFL player because they destroyed him before he got a legitimate chance to show it. So I'm not a big fan of those guys being labeled as busts, and I'm not a big fan of guys who crapped out due to injury being labeled as busts.
Oh yeah, injuries different. Injuries. I think there's a fairly big difference between a guy busting by injury, someone like Ejana Carter, or a guy who just didn't have talent around him and then didn't succeed. Sometimes you can overcome that. We've seen guys at times do it, so I don't think it's
the only time I think you can change that injury stance.
I do feel bad.
The only time I think you can change the injury thing is if a guy has like a laundry list of injuries at the time you took him high in the draft, at which point kind of your own fault. One that didn't fit into any category, but I thought had to be mentioned because I didn't know this at the time. But in the 1992 draft, the Indianapolis Colts had the number 1 and the number 2 overall pick, and somehow conspired to pick back-to-back busts. They picked a guy in Steve Emtman, who was a defensive end who I've clearly never heard of, having tried to pronounce that name. Apparently had just a series of injuries and never became any kind of player. And then picked a linebacker, Quinton Coryett, who also had a few years of nondescript play before crapping out of the league. I mean, there's a lot of...
Yeah, it's about as bad as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, there's some ugly draft histories and some teams that have had, bad run of things recently, but nobody has done that in a long time.
Oh, yeah. I like to talk about the Browns 2014 draft, Johnny Manziel and Justin Gilbert, how they would have been better just flushing money down a toilet instead of actually handing in cards for that one.
That was what, like 20-something and somewhere in like 8?
Yeah, it was like, 8 and like 24 or something like that. But
imagine that was number 1 and number 2. That's basically what the Colts did in 92.
I have not heard of that one prior to this. That's probably because it was like I was 2 years old, but still. Actually, I was 1 year old because it.
All right. Move on.
All right, the next segment, new segment now, called "Don't Read the Comments." One that was near and dear to Sam's heart. This is. He said it was his idea, but I had actually told him about this months ago. But now we're gonna do it because he thought it up this week, and it's Sam's idea though. So, Sam, what comments do you have for us this week?
Yeah, well, whether I stole it from you or I stole it from another podcast that will remain nameless, I think it's a good idea, and that's all that matters. So yeah, it's one of those constants of the internet is that you never read the comments. Nothing good lies in article comments ever. But I've decided that actually one thing that good comes from comments is podcast fodder. So I only wrote one article of significance this week. I've been doing other things. And yet in just that one article, there are 2 comments that I think are worth bringing up. So Mr. Cross-Eyed Lemon, which is kudos on the name, by the way, wrote, "More bash and trash of Adrian Peterson. What a surprise. Sam's obsession is starting to rival the one Trump has for Obama." I think I've written 2 articles on Adrian Peterson in like a year. So that's drawing
You're
something.
obsessed, Sam.
I know, obsessive. It was followed up by Patrick, who says, "This article is illogical and contradictory." Fair enough. Yep. But like I say, I've only got one article this week, but I decided that
if probably wasn't wrong about that.
Well, that's true. I decided that if I was going to find comment gold, the place to dive into was going to be the mock draft, because that's going to bring out the crazies like nothing else. And it didn't disappoint. Straight in there was a guy called Rodrell Green, who says, "Standing behind the excuse of this is what I would do should take into account what the team has already done. But Steve gone Steve." Steve is gone Steve, especially when it comes to mock drafts. So you got that one, Rodrell. Then the classic comment of, I don't even know what this guy's name is, just a bunch of letters and numbers, so I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. This is probably the worst mock I have seen yet. Good thing this is only what Steve Palazzolo would do and not what GMs will actually do. To which somebody, Dale R., has replied, agreed. Bizarre choices and players falling that make no sense. These are actually like tame, relatively tame. There's no
I was going to say, Sam, going to a mock draft for comments is just, one, it's cheating. And two, those were par for the course on a mock draft, I think.
They've actually been relatively tame, but I'm thinking it sets us a good benchmark to go forward from. We found, abuse but not lunacy, and then going forward we can try and get the real ire.
All right, well, feel free to leave comments on our articles, guys, and the crazier you get, the more likely it'll be that Sam picks it out for next week.
Absolutely.
Last segment, our favorite segment. Sam's been hitting good on these, I feel like. His grind, what grinds Sam's gears? Sam, what do you got this week for us again?
This week, it is can-do players. We're hitting draft time, and everyone wants to talk about what a player can do. This guy can make every throw in the book. This guy can, run downfield with a number one receiver regardless of the speed. This guy can block the best defensive ends in the game. All this kind of stuff. And you think, okay, that's nice, but how often does he do that? Like, if he can make all the best throws in the game, that's nice, but if he only does it 1 out of every 3 attempts, it's not much good to me. And I think draft time, we get lost in this whole sequence of can-do players, and we completely lose sight of how often players actually do this kind of stuff. And I'm all for drafting upside and potential and all this kind of stuff, but you have to ask the question that if a guy hasn't developed this part of the game in terms of doing this stuff regularly, what are the chances that he's suddenly going to hit the NFL and fix all that in the course of, an instant, an off season, where you go, okay, now he's realized all of this potential and he has ironed out the negatives and the bad spots and the lack of consistency, and he's become the player that we all think he can be. The bottom line is, if a guy's not doing this stuff on a regular basis, that's at least as big a red flag as the positive of being able to do them in the first place is on the other side.
Sam, you completely underestimate the hubris of NFL coaches, I feel like. You don't know that if a guy can do it once, a coach can make it so that he does it every single time? You didn't know that?
Yeah, it really is the problem. I think that's a huge part of it.
I mean, it is. Every time you hear a guy with potential, all coaches see is, I can get him to that potential. I'm greatest coach in NFL history right now. When in fact, it's rarely the case. Guys tend to be it's hard to develop things that you don't have and that you don't do regularly at the time. It's just hard to do that.
I'm almost more concerned by a guy who flashes the ability to do a specific thing, and it's not like he just doesn't know how to do it. So there's some, like pass rushers say, you can look at a guy and you can say, okay, he just doesn't know how to do this particular pass rush move. If we teach him how to do that, you've suddenly added an area, you've added an avenue to his repertoire that he didn't have before. But if you have a guy that flashes the ability to do that, and you're like, okay, he knows how to do that, why isn't he? Why don't I see that constantly throughout his tape? That, I think, is almost a bigger issue than a guy who just doesn't show it.
Now, Steve, we've talked about this on the draft podcast, how much frequency matters. Just the ability to do something doesn't really matter if you can't do it regularly. Everyone has the ability to make a 3-point shot in basketball. None of us are Steph Curry. You have to do it with frequency. It has to be repeatable, or else it's no good to us.
Clearly, you've never seen my 3-point hoop game.
Okay, yeah. We'll put a video of that. Do a reaction video of you shooting, Sam. I know you love those reaction videos now on Twitter.
If I was just, if I was just 5 or 6 inches taller, I would be in the NBA right now. I can't.
That'd be
why that wouldn't be the case.
Has Ireland produced anyone ever in the NBA?
I would highly doubt it, though. I don't actually.
Okay.
know.
Yeah,
I would seem like our
strength. I would guess no. Yeah, that's a safe bet. All right, that's it for us. Hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. We'll be back next week. Hopefully, there's some more news happening in the NFL to talk about, and we'll talk to you guys then. Have a good one.